June 12th, 1944, a ditch somewhere in Normandy, smelling of damp earth and cordite. For Obergefreiter Manfred Richter, a 19-year-old grenadier in the Panzer Division, the world had shrunk to this muddy trench and the deafening, percussive symphony of American artillery. For 72 hours, the shells had fallen, a relentless iron rain that didn't just kill, but shredded the very fabric of the landscape, turning lush French bocage into a surreal moonscape of splintered trees and churned soil. He and his comrades, boys who had been fed on stories of blitzkrieg and the invincibility of the German soldier, were now hunched, starving, and terrified. The propaganda had assured them the Americans were soft, a decadent nation of shopkeepers and jazz musicians who would fold at the first sign of determined resistance. But the force that had landed on these beaches was something else entirely. It was not an army, it was an industrial cataclysm. It wasn't the American soldiers they feared most, but their material. The sheer, unending quantity of it, the constant drone of their aircraft, the inexhaustible supply of their artillery shells, the endless columns of their trucks. They were fighting not a nation, but a factory, and the factory was winning. When the final assault came, it was almost a relief. Figures in olive drab swarmed their position. A brief, panicked exchange of fire, the clatter of his Mauser rifle falling into the mud, and then rough hands were on him, shouting in an alien tongue. He was now a prisoner of war, and as he was marched to the rear, past lines of Sherman tanks that seemed to stretch back to the ocean itself, a cold dread settled in his stomach, a fear far deeper than that of battle. He knew what happened to prisoners. Dr. Goebbels' newsreels had shown them. The Soviets starved you, worked you to death in Siberian mines. The British were cruel in their own quiet way. But the Americans were a nation corrupted by racial inferiors, a mongrel society run by vengeful Jews. He and his comrades expected brutality. They expected barbed wire, beatings and starvation. They expected to be treated as subhuman, the way their own ideology had taught them to treat others. What they never expected, what they couldn't have possibly conceived, was that the most powerful weapon the Americans would deploy against their minds was not a bayonet or a rifle butt, but a library card. This is the story of how an army of captured soldiers, raised on the dogma of National Socialism, expecting punishment and retribution, were instead confronted with the most disarming and revolutionary weapon in the American arsenal: an education. It's the story of how German POWs, imprisoned thousands of miles from the battlefield, were stunned to discover their captors weren't interested in breaking their bodies, but in liberating their minds. The journey across the Atlantic was the beginning of their disorientation. Packed into the hulls of Liberty ships, the very vessels that represented the industrial might they could no longer deny, the German prisoners were surprised by the first shock to their system: the food. After years of Wehrmacht rations, black bread, thin soup, and sausage of dubious origin, they were handed trays laden with white bread, something many hadn't seen in years. There was meat, jam, real coffee with sugar. It was a small thing, but profoundly unsettling. Propaganda had insisted America was stretched thin, its resources exhausted by the war. Yet here, on a transport ship, its enemies were fed better than its own soldiers had been at the height of their victories. This initial act of material generosity was a crack in the ideological armor of every man on board. They had been taught that the enemy was weak and degenerate, yet they were experiencing a level of logistical abundance they couldn't believe. It was a deliberate strategy. The American High Command, under the guidance of figures like General George C. Marshall, understood that the war would not end on the battlefield alone. A plan was needed for the peace that would follow, and a democratic, de-Nazified Germany was essential to that peace. The hundreds of thousands of German prisoners being shipped to camps across the United States were not just a logistical problem, they were an opportunity. They were a captive audience, a cross-section of German society that could be studied, influenced, and potentially transformed. Upon arrival in America, the prisoners were stunned again. Instead of the grim, muddy enclosures they had braced themselves for, they were transported to camps in places like Algona, Iowa, or Hearne, Texas, that looked less like prisons and more like well-ordered military bases. The barracks were clean, there were hot showers, and the grounds were often manicured. The guards were frequently older National Guardsmen, men who were more like firm but fair camp counselors than the brutal SS wardens of their imagination. They were offered work on local farms or in factories, and for this work, they were paid in scrip they could use at the camp PX to buy cigarettes, Coca-Cola, and Hershey bars. For men who had been told they were racially and culturally superior, the experience was a profound psychological shock. They saw an America that was not struggling or decadent, but staggeringly wealthy, efficient, and confident. They saw farmers driving their own cars, their wives shopping in stores filled with goods. It was a lifestyle of casual abundance that their own leaders had promised but never delivered. This display of American soft power was the critical first step in the De-Nazification process. Before you could challenge a man's political beliefs, you first had to demolish the lies upon which those beliefs were built. The lie that America was weak and inefficient was shattered by the sight of the Liberty ships. The lie that America was starving and decadent was shattered by the taste of a Hershey bar. But the greatest shock was yet to come. In 1944, the War Department quietly established a highly classified program, the Special Projects Division. Its mission was audacious: to use the POW camps as universities of democracy. The architects of this program reasoned that if these men could be exposed to the truth about history, about politics, about their own country, their ideological conditioning might be broken. The program began by secretly screening the prisoner population, identifying three groups: the blacks, who were die-hard, fanatical Nazis, the whites, who were confirmed anti-Nazis, and the vast majority in the middle, the greys, who were apolitical or simply going along. The strategy was to isolate the blacks, empower the whites, and focus all their efforts on converting the greys. Soon, trucks began arriving at designated camps like Fort Kearny in Rhode Island and Camp Ruston in Louisiana. They weren't carrying more barbed wire or machine guns. They were carrying books, thousands of them, textbooks on American history, the U.S. Constitution, English literature, economics, and world geography. They also brought film projectors with reels of Hollywood movies, documentaries, and most importantly, uncensored newsreels showing the reality of the war's progress. Then came the unbelievable offer. The prisoners were told they could enroll in voluntary courses, they could learn English, they could study a trade. They could even take university-level classes taught by American professors from nearby colleges or, in some cases, by German intellectuals and academics who had fled the Nazi regime. The prisoners were utterly bewildered. They had been prepared for indoctrination, for hours of forced lectures on the evils of Nazism. They never expected to be offered a genuine, voluntary education. Their entire worldview, built on the principle of force and obedience, had no way to process an enemy that sought to persuade rather than compel. This was a new kind of warfare, one that didn't target the body, but the mind. And for thousands of German soldiers, their first day in an American classroom, holding a textbook printed by their enemy, was the moment their transformation truly began. The classroom was a battlefield of ideas, and the primary weapon was the uncensored truth. For a young German man like Manfred Richter, who had spent his entire life in the suffocating echo chamber of Nazi propaganda, the experience was jarring. In the camp schoolhouse at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, he sat on a simple wooden chair and listened as a history professor from Harvard University explained the concept of the American separation of powers. He learned about checks and balances, about a system designed not to concentrate power in one man, but to limit it through a constitution. He read the words of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, ideas about individual liberty and human rights that were the complete antithesis of the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle that had demanded his absolute obedience. He and his fellow prisoners couldn't believe what they were hearing. They were skeptical at first, convinced it was just a more sophisticated form of propaganda. They would argue with the instructors, parroting the lines they had learned from the Hitler Youth. Why did America, a nation that spoke of freedom, have such deep racial segregation? How could a chaotic democracy possibly be more efficient than a state unified under a single, visionary leader? The American instructors, to their surprise, did not shut down these questions. They encouraged debate. They provided more books, more sources, and allowed the prisoners to argue amongst themselves. This in itself was a revelation. In Nazi Germany, questioning the official narrative was an act of treason. Here, it was part of the curriculum. The most powerful moments came from the German-born instructors, men who had seen the Nazi regime rise and had fled for their lives. These men could counter the prisoners' propaganda with first-hand experience. When a prisoner spoke of the economic miracle of the 1,930 seconds, the instructor could speak of the crushing of labor unions and the theft of Jewish property. When a prisoner spoke of national pride, the instructor could speak of the book burnings and the disappearance of his friends and colleagues into the Gestapo's prisons. Slowly, painstakingly, the walls of indoctrination began to crumble. The prisoners were stunned to learn the true history of their own country, reading German authors and poets who had been banned by the Reich. They discovered a Germany of science, art, and philosophy that had been erased and replaced by a crude, militaristic ideology. A key element of this intellectual reprogramming was the camp newspaper. At several camps, the Americans allowed the anti-Nazi white prisoners to publish their own newspapers, most famously Der Ruf, The Call. This publication, written and edited by prisoners like Alfred Anders and Hans-Werner Richter, was filled with articles on democratic theory, literature, and frank discussions about Germany's future. The very existence of this newspaper was a profound lesson in free expression. It was a symbol of the America they were now discovering, a nation so confident in its own ideals that it would give its enemies a printing press. The process was not easy. The die-hard Nazis, the blacks, did everything they could to stop it. They threatened the prisoners who attended classes, calling them traitors. They organized secret kangaroo courts, and sometimes beat or even killed prisoners they suspected of collaborating. The American camp commanders had to walk a fine line, enforcing the rules of the Geneva Convention while secretly protecting the white and grey prisoners who were participating in the education programs. This internal struggle within the camps was a microcosm of the larger war for Germany's soul. But the tide was turning, both on the battlefields of Europe and in the minds of the men in the camps. The definitive blow to their ideology came not from a book, but from a film projector. In the spring of 1945, after the war in Europe ended, the War Department sent official newsreels to the camps. These were films taken by Allied photographers at the newly liberated concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The prisoners were required to watch. For the first time, they saw the skeletal survivors, the piles of emaciated bodies, the gas chambers, and the crematoria. They saw the horrific, undeniable truth of the regime they had fought for. The silence in the makeshift theatres was absolute. Men who had faced enemy fire without flinching now wept openly. Others were physically ill. Decades of propaganda, of being told they were fighting a noble war to protect their homeland from Jewish Bolshevik conspirators, evaporated in the flickering black and white light of the screen. The education they had received over the preceding months had given them the intellectual framework to understand what they were seeing, to connect the hateful rhetoric they had been fed their whole lives to this ultimate, nightmarish conclusion. They were shocked not just by the evil of their leaders, but by their own ignorance. They had been lied to on a scale they had never imagined. For Manfred Richter and tens of thousands of others, this was the final, devastating disillusionment. The war was over, but their personal journey was just beginning. They were no longer soldiers of the Third Reich. They were students of a painful truth, facing the monumental task of returning to a country that was not only physically ruined, but morally bankrupt. They carried with them not the spoils of war, but something far more valuable, a new set of ideas and the intellectual tools to rebuild a nation from the ashes of its own self-destruction. The journey home was in many ways more daunting than the one that had brought them to America. As the ships carried them back across the Atlantic in late 1945 and 1946, they were returning to a world that no longer existed. Their cities were rubble, their government was gone, and their country was divided and occupied by the very powers that had held them captive. But these men were not the same soldiers who had surrendered in the hedgerows of Normandy or the deserts of Tunisia. The Americans had conducted a final, intensive 6-day course for the most promising graduates of their camp universities, a program held at Fort Eustis, Virginia. This was the final stage of a carefully orchestrated plan. These men were being deliberately prepared as the future intellectual and administrative leaders of a democratic Germany. They were given books, contacts, and a mission to help ensure that the poison of Nazism never rose again. When they arrived in the ruins of Germany, they were met with suspicion by their own people. They were seen as having had it easy, spending the war in comfortable American camps while their families endured Allied bombing and Soviet occupation. But they quickly proved their worth. While others were paralyzed by despair or still clung to the old ideologies, the graduates of the universities of the barbed wire got to work. They had a fluency in English and an understanding of democratic processes that was invaluable to the Allied occupation authorities. They never expected to be in such a position, but they became the crucial intermediaries, the bridge between the conquerors and the conquered. They helped establish new local governments, founded newspapers, committed to free press, and organized trade unions. Men who had once been cogs in the Nazi war machine were now the seeds of a new German democracy. The legacy of this audacious American experiment is written across the history of post-war Germany. Hans Werner Richter and Alfred Andersch, the editors of the POW newspaper Der Ruf, returned to Germany and founded Group 47, which became the most influential literary movement in post-war German society, launching the careers of future Nobel Prize winners like Günter Grass and Heinrich Böll. They championed a new German literature, one that confronted the nation's past with unflinching honesty. Other graduates became prominent politicians, academics, and industrialists, helping to shape the West German constitution and steer the nation toward the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds. They were men who had been captured as enemies, but returned as partners. The American strategists had made a remarkable gamble. They had wagered that ideas could be more powerful than armies, that education was a more effective tool of conquest than occupation. They understood a fundamental truth that their totalitarian adversaries never could, that a mind changed by reason is a permanent ally, while a body broken by force is merely a temporary subject. The program was a stunning success, yet it remained a secret for decades, classified by the US government. The story of how America re-educated its enemies was seen as potentially controversial, both at home and abroad, but its impact was undeniable. The textbook became a symbol of a different kind of American power. While the world saw the B-17 bomber and the Sherman tank as the instruments of America's victory, the true, lasting victory was won in quiet camp classrooms with chalkboards and dog-eared copies of the Federalist Papers. The German soldiers were initially surprised by the abundance of American food and the comfort of their camps. They were stunned by the offer of a free education. But ultimately, they were transformed by the simple, radical act of being treated not as racial inferiors or ideological enemies, but as human beings capable of reason and redemption. The United States had not only defeated the Third Reich on the battlefield, it had systematically dismantled its ideology in the minds of a generation of its soldiers. In the final analysis, America's greatest weapon was never its atomic bomb, but its unshakable confidence in its own founding principles, a confidence so profound that it dared to teach those principles to its captured enemies, certain that the truth, once heard, would ultimately prevail. The sheer scale of this intellectual and logistical undertaking is difficult to comprehend, even in hindsight. By the end of the war, there were over 425,000 German prisoners of war held in more than 500 camps across the United States. While the intensive re-education programs were focused on specific camps and a carefully selected cohort of prisoners, the broader exposure to American life and ideals had an effect on nearly all of them. The program was a testament to a uniquely American approach to warfare, one that looked beyond the immediate goal of military victory to the long-term objective of a stable, peaceful world. It was a strategy born of pragmatism as much as idealism. American policymakers recognized that a vengeful peace, like the one imposed at Versailles after World War I, would only sow the seeds for future conflict. A rehabilitated Germany was essential for the reconstruction of Europe and for creating a bulwark against the new looming threat of Soviet expansionism. The prisoners themselves were a resource that could not be wasted. These were not just nameless, faceless enemies. They were farmers, engineers, teachers, and craftsmen. Their energy and skills would be desperately needed to rebuild their shattered nation. But first, the ideological poison had to be drawn out. The curriculum in the camps was designed to be a direct antidote to Nazi teachings. Where Nazism taught racial purity, the Americans taught cultural anthropology and the history of immigration in the United States, showing how a nation could draw strength from diversity. Where Nazism taught the supremacy of the state and the leader, the Americans taught the principles of individual rights and government by consent of the governed. Where Nazism taught a warped, mythologized version of German history, the Americans provided access to uncensored historical texts that allowed the prisoners to rediscover their own country's rich intellectual and humanistic traditions. The prisoners never knew what to make of it all. Letters they sent home, which were censored and studied by US intelligence, reveal a deep sense of confusion and wonder. A soldier would write to his wife, describing how he had just finished a course on crop rotation taught by a professor from Iowa State University, or how he had spent the evening watching a Hollywood film starring James Cagney. These were experiences so far removed from the grim reality of the war and the bleak future they had imagined for themselves that they struggled to articulate them. The contrast between the American reality and the Nazi propaganda was a constant source of cognitive dissonance. They were told Americans were lazy, yet they saw a nation working with terrifying efficiency. They were told Americans were uncultured, yet they were being offered courses on Shakespeare and Goethe. The entire edifice of lies they had been raised on was proven false, not by lectures, but by direct, daily experience. They couldn't believe the level of trust they were sometimes afforded. In many rural areas with labor shortages, prisoners were sent out to work on farms with minimal supervision, often eating lunch with the farmer's family. They were treated with a level of decency and respect that fundamentally challenged their belief in a world governed by brutal power dynamics. This was the shock and awe of American kindness, and it was often more effective than a division of tanks. The symbolic object of this entire campaign was not a weapon, but the humble textbook. For every prisoner who enrolled in a course, the textbook represented something profound. It was a physical manifestation of a world of knowledge that had been denied to them. But it was also a symbol of America's seemingly infinite capacity. A nation that, in the midst of a global war, could afford to manufacture and ship millions of books for the sole purpose of educating its enemies, was a nation whose power was of a different order of magnitude than they had ever conceived. It was a power that wasn't just industrial, but intellectual and moral. It demonstrated a foresight and a strategic patience that was utterly alien to the short-sighted, nihilistic worldview of Nazism. The success of the program varied, of course. Not every prisoner was denazified. Some remained committed to the ideology until the very end, viewing the American efforts with cynical contempt. But the program wasn't designed to convert everyone. It was designed to create a critical mass of men who, upon their return, could form the nucleus of a new civil society. By targeting the Greys, the vast apolitical majority, and providing them with the tools for critical thinking, the Special Projects Division achieved exactly that. They created a vanguard for a democratic Germany, and the post-war success of the Federal Republic is, in no small part, a testament to the success of this audacious and clandestine American plan. As the last of the German POWs were repatriated in 1947 and 1948, the camps across America were dismantled, their brief, strange history fading into the background of local memory. The story of what happened within their fences remained classified, a forgotten chapter of the war. But the legacy of the universities of the barbed wire lived on, woven into the very fabric of modern Germany. The men who returned were forever changed. They had witnessed a different way of life, been exposed to a different way of thinking. They had seen a society that, for all its flaws, was built on a foundation of optimism, individual liberty, and democratic debate. They had been captured expecting the worst of humanity and had instead been shown a surprising, disarming, and ultimately transformative measure of its best. The experience created a deep and lasting bond between many of these former enemies and the United States. For decades after the war, German veterans would hold reunions, not with their old Wehrmacht units, but with the other alumni of Camp Algona or Camp Herne. Some even corresponded with the American families they had worked for, or the professors who had taught them. They had left America with something more than just their lives. They had left with a new perspective that would guide them through the difficult process of rebuilding their own country. The epilogue to this story can be found in the peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Germany of today, a staunch ally of the United States and a cornerstone of a stable Europe. This outcome was not an accident of history. It was the result of a deliberate, calculated, and deeply intelligent strategy. The Americans understood that winning a war is about more than just defeating armies. It's about defeating the ideas that animate them. They recognized that the ultimate victory is not forcing an enemy to his knees, but helping him to stand up again on his own, as a friend. The German POWs were laughed at by some of their die-hard comrades for attending the American classes. They were called traitors for reading American books and engaging with American ideas. But their quiet intellectual journey behind barbed wire proved to be one of the most pivotal and least-known battles of the Second World War. The German soldiers climbing off the trains in places like Alabama and Mississippi expected punishment, they expected hatred, they expected a mirror image of the brutal ideology they themselves had served. What they found instead was a nation so powerful and so self-assured that it could afford to be generous, a nation that chose to fight the darkness of totalitarianism not with more darkness, but with the overwhelming light of knowledge. They were sent into captivity as soldiers of a failed and criminal regime, but through an extraordinary act of strategic foresight, they were sent home as the founding fathers of a new and better nation. The war against the Third Reich was won with bullets and bombs, but the war for Germany's soul was won with books and blackboards, an astonishing final victory that the prisoners themselves, until the very end, never saw coming.